is a rigged deal. It's a rigged trial. Our courts, everything is screwed up in New York. And by the way, this trial that I have now, that's a Biden trial. They want to keep me off the campaign trail.
His lack of ethic has nothing to do with me. I have not once talked to anyone in my administration about Trump's legal problems.
President Biden firing back at former President Donald Trump in a rare exclusive interview with Next Star Nation's Washington correspondent Rashad Hudson. That's after Trump has continually blamed President Biden for his legal woes, including the ongoing criminal trial in Manhattan about Stormy Daniels' hush money payments. Now, 7 jurors have been selected in that trial for Trump's alleged cover-up of the Stormy Daniels hush money payments. But the jurors were grilled, and I mean grilled, about their social media and political views in order to get the gig to be on the jury. So while more jurors still need to be selected, it's the first step in Trump's first criminal trial, which is, of course, the first trial for a president or former president to have a criminal trial. So joining me now from New York is The Hill's Zach Schonfeld. He has been covering the trial for us in New York all week. Zach, what's your biggest takeaway about some of the jurors who have already been selected? I know we still have more jurors that still need to be selected, but tell us about them.
I think when a lot of these prospective jurors got into the room, they were quite in shock. Some of them, it seems, did not know pretty much until that moment that they were about to walk in to the first criminal trial of a former president. So there were some prospective jurors as they were filling the judge's courtroom who were trying to crane their necks to get a look at Donald Trump. When Donald Trump was introduced to them, he turned around towards them and gave them a little bit of a smirk. So I think, a lot of them were just quite in shock. And as you're also saying, when we got to the questioning of the lawyers, questioning these prospective jurors, trying to figure out which ones they wanted to strike and which ones they were going to allow to move forward, we really saw the lawyers try to pin these jurors down of their political views, where they get their news, their social media habits. And we saw a lot of prospective jurors being really cautious and not wanting to outright say, I'm a Democrat or Republican. But the lawyers did get some of them to eventually concede their political views and what party they're in.
Were any of the jurors nervous about security?
I think this is very different than any other jury going into a criminal trial. These jurors are going through metal detectors on the 15th floor of this courthouse every time they walk in and out. That's part of the reason this process is going so slow. There have been times where we've just been sitting there waiting for a half an hour or more to get these huge groups of, at times, sometimes almost 100 jurors at once through the metal detectors. So it is certainly, very different from a normal jury where none of this would have to be in place. And so the process just logistically looks very different. So everything from that, just to simply how we're doing the questioning of jurors. A lot of times this normally sometimes would be done in a back room, not even in the courtroom. But Donald Trump has said that he wants to be present to see some of this stuff. And just because of logistical concerns of getting all the Secret Service, the lawyers, and Trump in there, just logistically, this whole process just looks a little bit different than your standard criminal trial.
But I guess why I asked is this isn't like when you get called for jury duty for a traffic violation and you got to show up for a case. I mean, this is the former president of the United States who might be president again in just a couple of months. And so for these jurors, this is not going to be something that they ever forget about. This is going to significantly impact each individual and their families. We've seen Trump go after the family of the judge, for example, the daughter of the judge. From the jurors' perspective, is this really something that they want to sign up for? Has that come up at all?
It has. So, first I'll say that there are being extensive steps here being taken to try to keep these jurors anonymous. So we don't know the jurors' names. We only know things about them based on how they're responding to these questions. Each side, the lawyers, the prosecutors, and defense literally only have one copy in writing of the jurors' names, and they're not allowed to photograph it or photocopy it or anything like that. So a lot of steps being taken here to make sure that these jurors' names do not come out to the public. But that being said, when the first group of 96 prospective jurors walked into the courtroom on Monday, the judge went through his preliminary instructions and then asked them, do you feel that you can be fair and impartial? He asked anyone who felt that they couldn't to raise their hands. Of that initial group of 96, more than 50 raised their hands saying they couldn't be fair and were immediately excused.
Wow. I mean, from your perspective, I know this was a lot's been made of Trump dozing off during these proceedings. I probably would have fallen asleep, and I'm a journalist, and I'll probably get in trouble for saying that. But to be honest, I mean, Republican, Democrat, this stuff can be pretty tedious and arduous to get through. Did you fall asleep?
I did not, but, to a certain extent, I don't necessarily blame him of just the simple fact that this is a long process. The way this process is working is every prospective juror is getting in that jury box and they have to answer a 42-question survey. And I should also note some of these questions have multiple parts and they're reading the answers aloud. So for about 8 hours a day, we're just hearing jurors go through these 42 questions. So at sometimes Donald Trump was intently following along. He had his own copy of the questionnaire in front of him. But at other times, as this process was just dragging on and, we're going through this questionnaire over and over and over again, there were times where I saw him closing his eyes, sitting motionless in his chair, and, his head started to droop and, kind of jerk up a little bit, as if he was starting to fall asleep there. So he definitely was struggling to stay awake.
All right, meanwhile, back here in Washington, D.C. at the Supreme Court, the January 6th case moving forward. What's at stake for former President Trump on the January 6th case here at the SCOTUS level? And when do you expect a verdict on that, by the way?
So this is a case that applies to both Donald Trump as well as about more than 300 January 6th defendants. This is a challenge to one of the charges that has been brought against a lot of these defendants. The charge is obstruction of an official proceeding. And the question here is, what is the proper scope of this law? It was originally designed for white-collar crime. Now prosecutors are using it both against January 6th rioters as well as Donald Trump himself in his D.C. criminal case that accuses him of subverting the 2020 election results. So we saw some skepticism from the conservative justices on the Supreme Court about the scope of the statute, suggesting that perhaps the Supreme Court will claw back the statute, potentially throwing up convictions for January 6th rioters up into the air. And it also, like I said, could have implications for the D.C. criminal case for Donald Trump. But of course, there's no trial date there set. So unclear, even if it is upheld, whether that case will ever go to trial. In terms of the timing on a decision here from the Supreme Court, I think it's likely that we'll see it by the end of June. This argument is quite late in their annual term, so I'd be pretty surprised if we see it much before June.
All right, good stuff. Zach Schonfeld, thanks so much. The Hill's legal reporter. Thanks, Zach.
Thanks.
Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson says he's going ahead with his plan to pass aid for Israel and Ukraine. President Biden touched on the war in Gaza in that exclusive interview with Next Our Nation's Rashad Hudson, and he took a swing at Speaker Johnson's plan. Take a listen.
That's not the best way to do it. The best way to do it is just send it over, because they have overwhelming number of votes would pass it. Look, this is one of the least functional House leaderships that we've had in a long time, not because of his fault. I've agreed with him that passing each of these individually and separately, we would support as an alternative. The better alternative is just to pass it all right away.
Joining me now with the latest is the Hill's Julia Manchester. Julia, we were talking about this in the newsroom. The White House says that they are opposing a standalone Israel and foreign aid bill, but essentially now Speaker Johnson has come around, it seems, to what Democrats want, but President Biden isn't happy. So what's going to happen, and is Speaker Johnson going to have a job when all is said and done?
Yeah, that's the question. It's, maybe Biden might not be happy, but Republicans, particularly conservative Republicans like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Thomas Massie, who have threatened Johnson with this motion to vacate, they aren't happy with this. So this is a huge risk for Johnson to be taking, knowing that he's going to alienate some members of his own conference. Now, going forward, we have heard that there are Democrats who would be willing to essentially protect Johnson throughout this, but I don't think we'll really know until we have, know exactly who's supporting Johnson and who isn't, and have those numbers. I do know that a number of Republicans are getting tired of this go round with the motion to vacate. Then, the speaker is ousted. They have to get a new speaker. We saw it happen last year with Kevin McCarthy. And I think there's a real fear about doing it again, because just like when Kevin McCarthy was ousted last year, Kevin, Republicans didn't have a plan as to who they wanted to replace him with. They got Mike Johnson. Mike Johnson does not have this kind of legislative leadership experience that Kevin McCarthy had. So that makes it more difficult. So without Mike Johnson, the question is, who would be it?
Well, do you really think Speaker Johnson wants those headlines saved by Democrats? You just said that. My jaw, I had to pick it up off the floor. From a public relations standpoint, in terms of Speaker Johnson and just trying to navigate his way within conservative circles, he's a goner if the narrative is Democrats save your speakership. No?
No, I think that's the flip side of it. And I think it depends on on how many Republicans jump on board as well. If there are some Democrats and Republicans working together, that's one thing. But look, I think it depends on where the Republican conference is on this right now and whether they're willing to take that plunge to essentially activate the motion to vacate.
Well, something they did do that appears to be going nowhere is that Senate impeachment trial for Department of Homeland Security Alejandro Mayorkas. He's not expected to be convicted in the Senate, despite being impeached in the House of Representatives. But this really hasn't panned out what the Freedom Caucus had hoped for, has it?
No, it hasn't. I mean, look, there was really no hope for this at the end of the day. Democrats control the Senate, and Democrats aren't going to convict one of President Biden's cabinet secretaries. It's just not going to happen. I think what a lot of Republicans were hoping for is that this would maybe spread some awareness around the issue of immigration, particularly on how the Biden administration has been handling immigration, and shed some light on that. The problem is, though, the majority of immigration lawyers who have spoken out on this say Alejandro Mayorkas, regardless of whether you think he's done a good job or not, he hasn't done anything to violate the law. So in terms of, his impeachment trial, the trial in the Senate, I think a lot of critics view this as political theater, and it comes at a time where obviously Americans are sick and tired of this partisanship. They don't want to see another impeachment for political theater purposes.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. And it really does. It kind of had the reverse effect. No one was actually talking about the policy issue. They were talking about the politics of the impeachment theater, to your point. I mean, Democrats, by the way, they're banking that attacking Trump on the campaign trail is going to boost Biden in 2024. This is the same approach that they took back in the 2020 cycle, but is it going to work again in 2024?
Look, it's a good question. In terms of what happens in 2024, I think a lot of it depends on what Donald Trump really does. Going forward. On the with his legal issues, and also with this effort to impeach Biden on Capitol Hill. I mean, on that front, it's just sort of, once again, I think seen as political theater. It hasn't gotten a lot of galvanization, a lot of steam picked up. But back to President Trump's legal issues. With that, that's interesting because we've seen it really work for him in the primary, in the Republican presidential primary, that is, where he'd show up at these courthouses and make statements and really get a lot of attention and galvanize his base against his Republican opponents. But while Trump is busy in the courtroom, this week in Manhattan, Biden is in Pennsylvania talking to voters. That's a major swing state. So clearly, one's doing a more traditional form of campaigning while the other is tied up with his own legal issues. We'll see which one is more appealing to voters. But I would imagine a candidate, an incumbent, talking about the state of the economy, what they plan to do to improve it, might be a bit more attractive.
But Julia, Republicans are also telling me that they think that Trump on trial is a moot issue for voters. I mean, you're the expert. I mean, what's America thinking? What are the polls saying? Do you see what I just did there? I plugged your show on the Hill TV. What's America thinking? But do the polls reflect that? What Republicans are telling me is that they're not ranking Trump's legal woes as high on their priority list for their decision making in the ballot box in November.
Well, thank you for that plug. And yeah, the polls are showing that they are more interested, voters are more interested on issues like the economy, healthcare, immigration, crime, the list goes on. The problem, though, for Trump is if you have Biden out there talking about the economy in battleground Pennsylvania, while Trump is in Manhattan in a courtroom kind of railing against his own legal issues, you wonder what's going to resonate with voters more if Trump's going to get distracted. Good point.
Good point. Julie Manchester, host of the Hill TV's What's America Thinking? Hey, thanks, Jules.
Thank you.
WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange may be one step closer to returning to the United States to face espionage charges. The U.S. Embassy in London reportedly assured UK officials that Assange will not face the death penalty. That's after the UK court blocked his extradition, saying that the death penalty must be taken off the table in order to move forward. The news comes after President Biden said last week that he was considering an Australian request to pardon Assange. Assange's brother gave some insight into why the president would consider a pardon Wednesday morning on the Hill TV's Rising.
I think it's becoming a real political hot potato for the Biden administration. I don't believe they want a huge press freedom First Amendment case arriving here during an election season. I think that could be very worrying for them, particularly when they're trying to frame the opposition as being, anti-press freedom when they've got, arguably the most famous journalist in the world being held in a UK prison and possibly being prosecuted.
The UK court is set to rule next month whether or not to extradite Assange or allow him to appeal again. That's it for today's Daily Debrief. My name is Kevin Cirilli. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.